The Alpha King expected to watch a death recording. Instead, he watched his own beast lower its massive head into a stranger's lap and wag its tail. And the moment the tail hit the ground, Caspian felt it in his chest, like something snapped loose inside him. His fingers tightened around the console, breath uneven, because whatever that Omega was doing down there, his beast wasn't the only one reacting. 48 hours earlier, Ezra Tanaka sat across a cold steel desk, staring at a contract that could decide the fate of everything he had built. 26 years old, unbonded, unbroken. He was an Omega, but not the kind most people understood. He was what specialists called a resonant Omega, someone whose pheromones didn't submit to alpha pressure. Instead, they adapted, stabilized, and in some cases overrode. No alpha had ever forced him to kneel. Not once. That rare trait made him one of the best in the field when it came to handling unstable alphas and aggressive predators. It also made him expensive. But right now, reputation didn't matter. His sanctuary was running out of time. For 6 years, Ezra had been running a remote rescue facility that took in animals no one else would touch. Feral wolves, hybrid predators, creatures already marked for euthanasia. He kept them alive. He rehabilitated them. But sympathy didn't pay for land or security, and debt was catching up fast. If he failed to secure funding this month, everything would collapse. Across from him sat Dr. Alistair Vance, a corporate fixer who specialized in cleaning up problems for powerful alphas. Mid-40s, perfectly composed, the kind of man who spoke calmly about dangerous things. He slid the contract forward without hesitation. Your client is Caspian Wolf. Ezra didn't react. But the name carried weight. Caspian Wolf. The Alpha King, who controlled the Northern Territory. A reclusive apex alpha whose pheromones alone could force submission from trained alphas. Packs answered to him. Entire territories shifted around his presence. He rarely appeared in public. And when he did, people remembered one thing, the pressure. Like standing too close to something that didn't see you as equal. Ezra flipped through the contract. You said this is about an animal. What exactly am I dealing with? Vance adjusted his glasses. A wolf, or something close to it. Unregistered genetics. Extreme aggression. Carries alpha-level pheromones comparable to Mr. Wolf himself. He paused, watching Ezra carefully. It has already injured multiple alpha security personnel. Riot gear. Sedatives. None of it worked. Ezra's fingers stopped on the page. So you want it controlled. We want it stabilized, Vance corrected smoothly. If that fails, it will be eliminated. His tone didn't change. No hesitation. No concern. To him, it was just another problem to erase. Ezra closed the contract slowly. Why me? Because you specialize in cases others consider lost, Vance said. And because you are the only Omega on record who can stand in front of a dominant alpha without collapsing. That was true, but not the whole truth. Ezra picked up the pen. I don't tame things, he said quietly. I understand them. Then he signed. 2 days later, Ezra drove up a winding mountain road that cut through dense forest and heavy fog. The higher he went, the quieter it became. No signal. No traffic. Just distance from the rest of the world. When the estate finally came into view, it didn't look like a home. It looked like a controlled territory carved into the mountain itself. Dark stone, reinforced glass, layered security built to keep things out or in. At the main gate, he was stopped immediately. Graham, head of security, heavily built with old scars that told their own story. An alpha who had clearly survived more than one bad situation. His gaze lingered on Ezra for a second longer than necessary, like he was trying to figure out why an Omega was being allowed inside. He scanned Ezra, confiscated his phone, then stepped aside. Follow me. Inside, the air felt wrong. Not cold. Pressured. Ezra felt it before he saw him. Caspian Wolf stood near a wide window overlooking the mountains. Completely still. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply, but everything about him carried weight. When he turned, the shift in the room was immediate. Pheromones. Heavy. Dominant. Absolute. An ordinary Omega would have dropped without thinking. Ezra didn't move. He stood there, breathing evenly, as his own pheromones adjusted on instinct, smoothing the pressure just enough to remain stable. Not resisting. Not submitting. Just synchronizing. Caspian noticed immediately. His amber eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. He stepped closer. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just inevitable. You're the Omega. I'm the one you hired, Ezra replied calmly. Brief silence. That answer alone told Caspian more than any file ever could. No submission instinct. No fear response. Not even forced politeness. Just balance. Caspian took a slow step closer. The pressure in the room should have intensified. Instead, something subtle shifted. For a split second, his pheromones didn't push. They aligned. Caspian's expression hardened immediately, like he rejected the reaction the moment it happened. You understand, he said, that what's below this estate is not something you can approach like a normal case. I don't approach anything normally, Ezra said. I observe first. Caspian studied him for a moment longer, then turned away. If it decides to kill you, my men won't reach you in time. I didn't come here expecting protection. Another pause. Then Caspian spoke without turning back. Graham will take you down. The lower levels felt like a sealed facility. Reinforced corridors. Controlled lighting. The air carried a faint metallic scent mixed with something sharper. Pheromones. Concentrated and unstable. Graham stopped in front of a heavy blast door, his posture tightening slightly. He doesn't sleep, Graham said. Doesn't eat right. Keeps pacing. Broke reinforced glass last week. A short pause. I've seen alphas lose control before. This is worse. Ezra nodded once. And Aaron, Graham hesitated. Just for a second. He doesn't come down here. That answered more than anything else. The door opened. Inside was an observation room separated by reinforced glass. Beyond it, an enclosed environment designed to look natural, but still a cage. Dirt, rocks, water. And in the center, the wolf. Ezra stopped. It was massive. Larger than any predator he had worked with. For that swallowed the light. Muscles built for impact. But what mattered wasn't the size. It was the scent. Pure alpha. Ancient and familiar. Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly, because beneath the aggression, beneath the instability, the pheromone signature was identical to the one standing upstairs. The moment he stepped closer to the glass, the wolf stopped pacing. Slowly it turned. Locked onto him. A low, vibrating growl rolled through the enclosure, strong enough to hum through the reinforced walls. Graham's hand moved toward the emergency control panel. If you go in there, he said, we shoot if necessary. Ezra didn't look away. No. Graham frowned. That's not your call. It is if you want results, Ezra said calmly. Turn off the turrets. Silence. Then a green light blinked. Authorization granted. Caspian was watching. Ezra exhaled slowly, letting his body settle. His pheromones shifted, low, steady, neutral. Not inviting. Not defensive. Just present. The inner gate unlocked with a heavy sound. He stepped inside. The wolf didn't charge. It lowered its head slightly and began to move toward him. Slow and controlled. Each step carried weight. And then, Ezra felt his instincts react, but he didn't step back. Instead, he did the one thing no one in that facility expected. He sat down. Open posture. No defense. No challenge. The wolf stopped just a few feet away. Close enough that Ezra could feel the heat from its body. Close enough that one wrong move would end everything. Ezra slowly raised one hand. Palm open. Lo, an offer. Up in the control room, Caspian's grip tightened on the console. Because as the wolf leaned in, he felt it, the contact, like phantom fingers brushing against his own skin. And for the first time in years, his beast didn't want to fight. It wanted to stay. The wolf didn't attack. That alone was enough to make every alpha in the control room hold their breath. But what happened next, that was something no one there had ever seen before. Ezra kept his hand steady, palm open, low enough to avoid triggering dominance. His breathing was slow, controlled. His pheromones shifting into a calm, stable frequency. Not seductive, not submissive, just safe. The massive wolf stepped closer. Its amber eyes locked onto him. Its muscles coiled with restrained power. 5 steps away. 3. 1. Then it stopped, lowering its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it inhaled Ezra's scent. Up in the control room, Caspian felt it again, that exact moment. The inhale hit him like a physical sensation in his own lungs. His chest tightened, as if he were the one standing inches away from the Omega. His beast wasn't just observing. It was experiencing. Down in the enclosure, Ezra didn't move. He let the wolf take its time. That was the first rule. Never rush a predator that had learned to expect violence. The wolf's growl faded, replaced by a low, uneven rumble that didn't sound like a threat anymore. It sounded conflicted. Ezra shifted his hand slightly, just enough to let his fingers brush against the thick fur near the wolf's chest. The reaction was immediate. The wolf froze, and so did Caspian, because the moment Ezra made contact, Caspian felt it like electricity running straight through his nerves. Not pain, not fear. Something warmer. Something dangerously close to relief. His fingers dug into the metal console as his breathing faltered. This wasn't supposed to happen. There was never supposed to be a connection this strong. In the enclosure, the wolf let out a low sound. Not a growl this time, something softer. Almost uncertain. It leaned forward, just slightly, pressing more of its weight into Ezra's hand. Ezra exhaled quietly. That was permission. Slowly, carefully, he moved his hand upward, fingers sliding into the thick fur behind the wolf's ear. He applied steady pressure, firm but controlled. The wolf's entire body tensed for a second, then dropped. A heavy exhale left its lungs as its hind legs buckled. Its massive body lowered onto the ground. Its head tilted slightly, pressing harder into Ezra's touch. The sound it made this time was unmistakable. A soft whine. Graham, standing behind a glass, stared in disbelief. "That's not possible," he muttered under his breath. This was the same creature that had nearly torn through reinforced armor. The same beast that had sent trained alphas to the hospital. And now it was leaning into an Omega's hand like it had been waiting for this. Ezra didn't react outwardly, but inside he understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't dominance. This wasn't submission. This was deprivation. The wolf had been isolated, cut off from any form of pack contact, any form of physical reassurance. For something carrying alpha-level pheromones, that kind of isolation didn't just create aggression. It broke stability. "You're not violent," Ezra said quietly, his voice low and even. "You're just exhausted." The wolf let out another low sound, pressing its head down further until it rested fully against Ezra's lap. Its body relaxed inch by inch, tension bleeding out of its limbs. Ezra adjusted his posture slightly to support the weight. His hand continued to move through the thick fur in slow, steady strokes. Upstairs, Caspian's world tilted, because he felt all of it. The pressure of fingers, the warmth, the calm. For years, his existence had been defined by control, suppressing instinct, locking away the part of him that wanted to dominate, to tear, to claim. He had cut that part out of himself, turned it into something separate, something contained. But now that part wasn't raging. It wasn't trying to break free. It was content. Caspian's breathing became uneven. His control slipped for just a second. He turned away from the screen, running a hand through his hair, trying to ground himself. This wasn't supposed to happen. No one was supposed to get this close. No one was supposed to affect him like this. Back in the enclosure, Ezra shifted slightly, testing boundaries. He moved his hand along the wolf's neck, then down toward its shoulder. No resistance. No aggression. Just quiet acceptance. That confirmed it. The wolf wasn't unstable because it was uncontrollable. It was unstable because it had never been given a point of balance. Turn off the external monitoring audio, Ezra said calmly, without looking back. Graham frowned. Why? Because if it hears constant surveillance, it won't fully relax, Ezra replied. Right now, it's choosing not to see me as a threat. Don't ruin that. Graham hesitated, then glanced at the camera. A second later, the audio feed cut. Caspian watched in silence, now unable to hear what Ezra was saying, but still feeling every second of contact like it was happening to him directly. His chest rose and fell slower now, sinking unconsciously with the rhythm below. That was when he realized something far more dangerous. It wasn't just the beast responding. He was too. Minutes passed, then longer. The wolf didn't move away. If anything, it shifted closer, its massive body pressing into Ezra's legs like it didn't want the contact to end. Ezra didn't push it away. He adjusted, grounding himself, letting the weight settle. This isn't about control, Ezra murmured softly. You don't need to fight everything. The wolf's tail moved once. Then again. Graham stared, frozen, because that wasn't a reflex. That was intentional. The alpha-level predator, the one that had never shown submission to anyone, was responding to an omega. Not with fear. Not with resistance. But with something far more dangerous. Trust. Upstairs, Caspian closed his eyes briefly, his jaw tightening. The sensation hit him again, stronger this time. The slow, steady strokes. The calm that followed. It was addictive. That was the only word for it. His beast wasn't just accepting Ezra. It was attaching. Caspian opened his eyes again, gaze locking onto the screen. His voice came out lower than before, almost rough. Pull him out. Graham stiffened. Sir, he's stabilizing it. Pull him out. But Ezra didn't move. He hadn't heard the order. And even if he had, he wouldn't have listened. Because in that moment, he felt it too. Not just the wolf's breathing. Not just its heartbeat slowing beneath his hand. Something else. A second presence. Distant, but connected. Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly. Then slowly he spoke under his breath, barely louder than the wolf's breathing. You're not alone in there, are you? The wolf's ear twitched. And upstairs, Caspian froze. Because for the first time, the Omega wasn't just reaching his beast. He was reaching him. Ezra didn't pull his hand away. That was the difference between him and everyone else who had ever stepped into that enclosure. Most people reacted the moment something felt wrong. They broke contact, shifted position, tried to regain control. Ezra did none of that. He stayed exactly where he was, fingers still buried in the thick fur, breathing slow and even, pheromones steady, but his mind had already locked onto what he just felt. There was something else connected to this wolf, not just instinct, not just behavior, something conscious. The wolf's body remained pressed against him, heavy and grounded, but its ear twitched again when Ezra spoke. That tiny reaction confirmed it. It wasn't just responding like an animal. It was listening. Up in the control room, Caspian didn't move. For the first time since this started, his expression lost that cold control. Fingers hovered over the console, but he didn't press anything. Because if he stopped this now, he might lose whatever connection had just formed. And that thought unsettled him more than anything. Down below, Ezra slowly shifted his position, adjusting one leg so he could sit more comfortably under the wolf's weight. He didn't rush. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. He let his hand move again, sliding from behind the wolf's ear, down along its neck, then to its shoulder. No resistance, No tension. The wolf allowed it, even leaned slightly into the touch. That's it, Ezra murmured quietly. You don't need to prove anything. The wolf exhaled heavily. Its breathing was now slow and deep. Its body had completely changed. The rigid, coiled tension from before was gone. In its place was something calmer, something stable. Ezra had seen this before, in traumatized animals, but never at this scale, never with this level of pheromone intensity. He focused again. There it was, that second presence, faint but unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the wolf's body. It felt layered, like something overlapping it. Ezra's eyes shifted slightly, but he didn't look up at the cameras. He kept his attention on a wolf, speaking softly, as if the words were meant for both of them. You're connected, he said under his breath. Not just physically. The wolf's breathing hitched. Upstairs, Caspian's grip tightened on the console. He felt that too. The reaction. The awareness. His pulse spiked, something sharp cutting through the calm that had settled in his chest. This Omega was figuring it out, faster than anyone ever had. Ezra didn't stop. You've been separated for too long, he continued, voice still calm and steady. That's why it hurts. The wolf let out a low sound, deeper this time, almost like a suppressed growl. But it didn't move away. Stayed right there, head still resting against Ezra's lap. That was the key. It didn't reject him, which meant he was right. Ezra slowly lifted his other hand, bringing it closer to the wolf's face. He paused halfway, giving it time to react. The wolf's eyes flicked toward the movement, watching closely. But it didn't snap, didn't retreat. Ezra gently placed his hand along the side of its jaw, fingers resting lightly against the fur. Contact. And again Caspian felt it. Stronger this time. Not just the physical sensation, but the intent behind it. The calm. The acceptance. It spread through him in a way he couldn't control, pushing past every barrier he had built over the years. His breathing slowed against his will. His shoulders dropped slightly, tension leaving his body without permission. That was when it hit him. This wasn't just the beast calming down. Ezra was stabilizing both of them. Caspian stepped back from the console, running a hand down his face, trying to regain control. This was dangerous. He knew it. If this continued, the line between him and the beast would start to blur again, and that was exactly what he had tried to prevent. But he didn't stop it. Because for the first time in years, he didn't want to. Back in the enclosure, Ezra adjusted his grip slightly, applying a bit more pressure along the wolf's jawline, testing its tolerance. The wolf responded immediately, tilting its head into his hand, pressing harder. That confirmed something important. This isn't aggression, Ezra said quietly. It's deprivation. The wolf's tail moved again, slower this time, brushing lightly against the ground. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't reactive. It was controlled, intentional. Graham, still watching through the glass, lowered his hand from the emergency control panel without even realizing it. His posture had shifted too. Tension in his shoulders eased slightly. His gaze no longer locked in anticipation of an attack. Instead, he was watching something else entirely. Something he didn't understand. Minutes passed, but Ezra didn't rush. He let the wolf settle deeper into the contact. Let its breathing stabilize fully. Then slowly he leaned forward, just a fraction, bringing himself closer to its head. You've been alone for too long, he said softly. No peck, no contact, no anchor. The wolf's body tensed for just a second, then relaxed again. That hesitation told Ezra everything. There was recognition there, not instinct. Memory. Upstairs, Caspian's chest tightened sharply. The word hit him harder than anything else Ezra had said. Alone. That was the exact reason he had done all of this. To isolate the part of himself that couldn't function in a structured hierarchy. To contain it. To control it. But now that isolation was the problem. Ezra's hand moved again, slower this time, more deliberate. He shifted his fingers into the thicker fur at the base of the wolf's neck, applying steady pressure in a circular motion. The wolf let out a deep, low sound, almost a rumble, and its entire body sank further into the ground. Completely relaxed. "That's it," Ezra murmured. "You don't need to fight me." The wolf's eyes closed. "Not fully, but enough." "Trust." Ezra's gaze softened slightly, but his focus remained sharp. He had confirmed the behavioral pattern. He had established physical contact. Now came the next step. Connection. "You can feel him, can't you?" Ezra said quietly, almost like he was thinking out loud. The wolf's ear twitched again. Upstairs, Caspian stopped breathing for a second. "But he can feel you too," Ezra continued. The wolf shifted slightly, pressing its head more firmly against Ezra's lap, as if reacting to something deeper than just the words. Ezra's voice dropped lower. "You're not separate." Silence. Then the wolf let out a slow breath. And for a split second, Ezra felt it again, that second presence. Clearer this time. Not just overlapping. Reaching back. Ezra's eyes narrowed slightly, his hand still moving slowly through the fur. There it was. A response. He didn't smile. He didn't react outwardly. But internally, everything aligned. This wasn't just a rehabilitation case. This was something else entirely. Something that had never been documented. And as the massive wolf lay there calm grounded, its body fully relaxed under his touch, Ezra understood one thing with absolute certainty. He hadn't just stepped into a cage with a dangerous alpha beast. He had stepped into the center of something broken. And for the first time, it was starting to respond. From that day forward, the pattern changed. Ezra stopped being a visitor in the enclosure. He became part of it. Every morning, before the security team even rotated shifts, the massive wolf was already waiting near the inner gate. Not pacing. Not slamming its body against reinforced walls like before. It waited. Still. Alert. The moment the lock disengaged, it would step forward. Not aggressively, but with a kind of focused anticipation that no one there had ever seen from it before. Graham, who monitored the lower-level security, noticed it first. He had been the one nearly killed during the early containment phase, and he knew exactly how unpredictable the beast had been. Now he stood behind the glass, arms crossed, watching something that made no sense to him. "It's tracking his schedule," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Like it knows when he's coming. Ezra didn't treat it like a miracle. He treated it like progress. Each session followed a structure. He would enter slowly. No sudden movements. Pheromones steady and controlled. He would sit, never stand over it, never challenge at height or space. The wolf would approach every time, lowering its head just slightly before making contact. That detail mattered. It wasn't submission. It was acknowledgement. Ezra reinforced it the same way each time. Consistent. Touch steady. Pressure calm. Breathing even. No rewards. No commands. Just presence. And every single time, Caspian felt it first. He tried to ignore it. He stayed in his office. Avoided the monitors. Buried himself in reports and meetings he hadn't attended in months. But it didn't matter. The moment Ezra stepped into the enclosure, the connection activated. The first brush of fingers through fur. The slow press of a hand against the wolf's neck. The shift in breathing. Caspian experienced all of it as if it were happening to his own body. It wasn't just sensation. It carried emotion. Calm, trust, warmth. Things he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was becoming a problem. 3 days in, he stopped pretending he could ignore it. By the end of the first week, he was watching every session. By the second week, he couldn't look away. Down in the enclosure, the wolf had changed completely. When Ezra was present, it no longer paced. It didn't growl. It didn't show its teeth unless startled by external noise. Instead, it stayed close. Too close sometimes. More than once, it had shifted its full weight onto Ezra's legs, pinning him to the ground like a massive living restraint. The first time it happened, the security team had almost triggered the emergency override. But Ezra had raised one hand slightly, signaling them to stand down. He didn't panic. He adjusted, shifted his position, kept one hand moving along the wolf's neck, maintaining contact. "It's not trying to trap me," Ezra had said calmly afterward, when Graham questioned it. "It's trying to stay anchored." Graham didn't like that explanation, but he couldn't argue with the results. Another change came quickly after that. The wolf started bringing things. Small things at first. A loose stone, a broken branch. It would carry them in its mouth and drop them near Ezra, then sit back watching him. The first time, Ezra didn't react. He observed. The second time, he acknowledged it, a slight nod, a brief touch to the object before returning his focus to the wolf. That was enough. The behavior repeated, more consistently. Offerings, Ezra explained later during a debrief. He stood across from Caspian in the main study, holding a tablet with recorded data. But his focus wasn't on the screen. This is pack resource sharing. It's trying to establish connection in a way it understands. Caspian leaned back slightly, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "It has no pack." "It does now," Ezra said simply. That answer lingered longer than anything else. Caspian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Ezra's hands. Clean, steady. The same hands that ran through his beast's fur every day. The same hands he felt every single time. His jaw tightened slightly. "You touch it constantly," Caspian said after a moment. His voice was lower than before. Ezra didn't look away. Physical contact is necessary. Without it, the stabilization won't hold. Caspian's gaze sharpened. "And you're certain it's only affecting the animal?" There it was. The question beneath the question. Ezra paused for half a second, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to matter. Then he answered honestly. "No." Silence filled the room. Caspian's fingers tightened slightly against his arm. "Explain." Ezra shifted his weight, setting the tablet down on the desk without breaking eye contact. "The connection isn't one-directional. It's layered. The responses I'm seeing, both behavioral and pheromonal, suggest that what's in that enclosure isn't isolated." Caspian didn't move. "It reacts to me," Ezra continued, voice steady. "But something else reacts with it at the same time. Same rhythm. Same shift. That doesn't happen with a normal subject." Another pause. Then Ezra said it. "You're linked to it." The words hung in there. Direct. Unavoidable. Caspian's expression didn't change. But the pressure in the room did. It dropped, then surged again, subtle but noticeable. For a second, the control slipped. Then it snapped back into place. "You're making assumptions," Caspian said coldly. "I'm observing patterns," Ezra replied. A long silence followed. Neither of them looked away. Then, unexpectedly, Caspian stepped forward. Not aggressively. Not dominant. Closer. Close enough that Ezra could feel the shift in temperature. The faint trace of Caspian's pheromones moving differently this time. Not pushing. Not suppressing. Searching. Ezra didn't step back. For the first time, the distance between them closed without resistance. Caspian's voice dropped quieter. "Then tell me, Omega, if what you're saying is true." His gaze flicked briefly to Ezra's lips, then back to his eyes. "Why does it calm down the moment you touch it?" Ezra held his gaze, unshaken. "Because it trusts me." Caspian's jaw tightened. "And why would it do that?" Ezra didn't hesitate. "Because I don't see it as something that needs to be controlled." The words landed harder than expected. Caspian stepped back abruptly, turning away, breaking the moment before it could go any further. His hand came up to his neck briefly, as if grounding himself. Tomorrow, he said, voice returning to its usual controlled tone. You'll extend the session time. Ezra nodded once. Understood. As he turned to leave, he paused for just a second. Glancing back, whatever you did to separate it, Ezra said quietly, it didn't solve the problem. Caspian didn't turn around. I know. Ezra left. And for the first time since this started, Caspian didn't feel in control of the situation anymore. Because the bond forming in that underground enclosure wasn't just stabilizing his beast. It was pulling him back towards something he had tried to bury. And the closer Ezra got, the harder it became to resist. By the start of the third week, the change was undeniable. The wolf no longer behaved like a contained threat. It behaved like something that had finally found its anchor. It waited for Ezra, followed him inside the enclosure, responded to his movement before he even spoke. And most importantly, it calmed the moment he made contact. For the security team, that was progress. For Ezra, it was confirmation. But for Caspian, it was something far more dangerous. Because the more stable the beast became, the less stable he felt. Every session hit harder than the last. The connection was no longer faint or distant. It was immediate. The moment Ezra stepped into the enclosure, Caspian felt the shift. When Ezra's hand moved, he felt it. When the wolf leaned in, he felt it. The weight of that contact in his own body. And when Ezra spoke in that low, steady voice, Caspian couldn't hear the words, but he felt the effect of them. Calm, warmth, acceptance, cutting through him in ways nothing else ever had. He stopped sleeping, not because he couldn't, but because every time he closed his eyes, the sensation lingered. Phantom touches. The echo of Ezra's presence followed him even outside the sessions, and it was getting stronger. Down in the enclosure, Ezra had stopped treating this like a standard case entirely. He no longer tracked just behavior. He tracked response timing, synchronization, overlap. The pattern was consistent now. Every reaction from the wolf had a mirror delay, barely measurable, but there, like a second system processing the same input. He tested it one morning. Instead of immediately reaching out, Ezra paused just inside the enclosure. He didn't move closer. He didn't initiate contact. He simply stood there watching. The wolf approached halfway, then stopped. Its head tilted slightly, waiting. Ezra stayed still. 3 seconds. 5, 10. The wolf shifted its weight, then let out a low sound, not aggressive, not warning. It stepped closer, slower this time, until it was within reach. Still, Ezra didn't move. Another second passed. Then the wolf lowered its head and nudged forward, pressing lightly against Ezra's hand without him offering it. Initiation. Ezra's eyes sharpened slightly. Good, he said quietly. Your choice. He finally moved his hand, placing it gently against the wolf's neck, reinforcing the behavior. That confirmed it. This wasn't dependency. This was active bonding. Upstairs, Caspian felt it the moment contact was made. But what caught him off guard was what happened before that. The waiting, the pause, the slight tension that built when Ezra didn't move. He had felt that too. The expectation, the need. Caspian's hand tightened against the edge of his desk. That wasn't just the beast reacting. That was him. Later that evening, Ezra stood in Caspian's study again for their daily debrief. The dynamic had shifted between them, even if neither of them openly acknowledged it. There was less distance now. Not physically, but something else had changed. Awareness. It initiated contact today, Ezra said, placing the tablet down. Not reactive. Intentional. Caspian didn't respond immediately. He stood near the window, looking out over the dark mountains. But his attention was clearly elsewhere. That means the bond is stabilizing, Ezra continued. It's not just accepting me anymore. It's seeking me out. Caspian's jaw tightened slightly. And what does that mean for containment? It means containment is no longer the priority, Ezra replied. Integration is. That word shifted something in the room. Caspian turned. Explain. Ezra met his gaze directly. You separated it to control it. But the separation is what destabilized it. It doesn't need to be controlled. It needs to be whole. Silence. Caspian's eyes darkened slightly, something sharper flickering beneath the surface. You're suggesting I reverse the process. I'm suggesting you stop treating it like something separate from you. That hit harder than anything else Ezra had said so far. Caspian took a slow step forward. The pressure in the room shifted again, subtle but present. His pheromones weren't pushing like before. They were unsettled, fluctuating. You don't understand what that means, Caspian said quietly. Then explain it. Ezra replied without hesitation. Another pause. Then for the first time, Caspian didn't deflect. It's not just instinct, he said, voice lower now. It's everything I cut out. Aggression. Dominance. The part of me that doesn't stop. He stopped. Ezra didn't interrupt. If I let that merge again. Caspian exhaled slowly, his hand tightening briefly at his side. It won't just stabilize. It will amplify. Ezra held his gaze. Then why is it calm with me? That question landed differently. Caspian didn't answer right away, because he knew the answer. But saying it out loud would make it real. Ezra stepped closer. Not aggressively, not cautiously, just enough. Because it trusts me, Ezra said. And you feel that too. Caspian's eyes flickered, just for a second. That was enough. Ezra didn't look away. This isn't just about it anymore. The bond isn't one-directional. You already know that. Caspian's breathing slowed. His posture remained tense. And what exactly are you implying? Ezra answered without hesitation. That it's not just your beast reacting to me. Silence. Then it's you. The words hung between them. Clear, direct, unavoidable. Caspian's control slipped for a fraction of a second. His pheromones shifted sharply, not outward, but inward, like something tightening, coiling. Then it settled again. But the damage was already done. Ezra had seen it. More importantly, he had felt it. Because standing this close now, the connection wasn't just in the enclosure anymore. It was here, between them, faint, but present. Ezra didn't step back. Instead, he did something no one had done since arriving at this estate. He reached out, slowly, deliberately. His hand stopped just short of Caspian's arm. A clear choice. No sudden movement. No pressure. Just an offer. Caspian's entire body went still. For a second, nothing happened. Then he didn't move away. That was all the permission Ezra needed. His fingers made contact. Light. Barely there. But enough. And the moment it happened, Caspian felt it. Not through the beast. Directly. Warmth spread instantly. Sharper, clearer than anything he had felt through the connection before. It wasn't filtered. It wasn't distant. It was real. Caspian's breath hitched slightly, his control slipping again before he could stop it. His hand twitched, like he was about to pull away. But he didn't. Ezra kept his touch steady. No pressure. No demand. Just presence. You're not as separate as you think, Ezra said quietly. Caspian's eyes lowered briefly, staring at the point of contact. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was losing control. He felt like something was finally aligning. And that realization was far more dangerous than anything else so far. Because if Ezra was right, then this wasn't just about stabilizing a beast. It was about undoing everything Caspian had built to keep himself contained. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to stop it. The days that followed blurred into something neither of them could control. Every session in the enclosure deepened the bond. Every touch lingered longer. Every moment apart felt heavier than it should have. Ezra stopped sleeping in the guest quarters. Not officially. Not by invitation, but somehow at some point he had started falling asleep in the observation room between sessions, curled in a chair near the glass, the wolf's presence on the other side like a slow, steady heartbeat. And Caspian started finding excuses to be there. Not inside the enclosure. Not yet. But nearby. Watching. Feeling. The connection had grown beyond the beast now. It existed between them directly, a thread of awareness that tightened every time they were in the same room. Ezra felt it when Caspian entered a space before he saw him. The shift in air pressure. The subtle pull in his chest. His pheromones would adjust automatically, reaching towards something they hadn't been designed to reach. It wasn't submission. It wasn't dominance. It was resonance. True resonance. The kind specialists wrote papers about but rarely witnessed firsthand. And Caspian felt it too, every moment of every day. He noticed it in small ways first. The way his hand would reach for things Ezra had touched. The way his breathing would slow when Ezra's pheromones drifted into his space. The way his beast, once a separate, contained thing, now stirred constantly, pressing against the inside of his chest like it was trying to get closer. Closer to him. By the end of the third week, Caspian stopped pretending he could keep his distance. It happened on a Tuesday. Late. After everyone else had left the lower levels. Ezra was still in the enclosure. The wolf was asleep, actually asleep, for the first time since anyone could remember, its massive body curled around Ezra like a living wall of fur and warmth. Ezra's hand rested on its side, rising and falling with each slow breath. He didn't hear the inner gate open, but he felt it. The shift in pheromones. The weight of a presence that didn't belong to the wolf. He looked up. Caspian stood in the doorway. Not in the observation room. Inside, on this side of the glass. For the first time since Ezra had arrived, the Alpha King had stepped into the enclosure. He wasn't wearing his usual composed expression. His jaw was tight. His hands were curled at his sides, not in aggression, but in something that looked like restraint. His eyes weren't cold. They were hungry. The wolf is asleep, Ezra said quietly. Not a question. Caspian didn't answer right away. He stepped forward slowly, each movement measured, controlled. But his pheromones betrayed him. They weren't controlled at all. They were flooding the space, thick and heavy and undeniably alpha. But not pushing. Reaching. It's been 3 weeks, Caspian said, his voice rougher than usual. And I still don't understand what you've done to it. I haven't done anything to it, Ezra replied evenly. I've done things with it. Caspian stopped a few feet away. Close. Too close. The sleeping wolf shifted slightly, but didn't wake. Too comfortable. Too trusting. You've changed it, Caspian said. Changed me. Ezra tilted his head. Is that a complaint? Caspian's eyes darkened. His pheromones spiked, sharp, sudden, overwhelming. And then he closed the remaining distance. Not slowly this time. Not carefully. He moved like a man who had been holding himself back for too long and had finally run out of reasons to keep doing it. His hand came up, not to strike, not to grab, just to touch. His fingers brushed against Ezra's jaw, light but deliberate. And the moment they made contact, everything changed. The connection that had been building for weeks, faint, distant, filtered through the beast, suddenly became direct. No separation. No buffer. Just them. Caspian's breath caught. His whole body went still. It's stronger, he said, barely above a whisper. When I touch you directly, it's... I know, Ezra said. Caspian's thumb traced along Ezra's jawline. Slow. Testing. His pheromones shifted again, not pushing dominance, but something else. Something that felt like need. You should have told me, Caspian said. I'm telling you now. Caspian's gaze dropped to Ezra's lips. Stayed there. This doesn't change anything, he said. But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. Because they both knew it wasn't true. Everything had already changed. My sanctuary, Ezra said quietly. You're still funding it? Caspian's eyes flicked back up to his. Yes. Why? Caspian's hand didn't move from Ezra's jaw. His thumb kept tracing, like he couldn't stop himself. Because you walked into a cage with something that could have killed you, he said slowly, and you didn't see a monster. The words hung between them. Ezra didn't look away. That's not an answer. Caspian's jaw tightened. His pheromones surged again, not aggressive, but intense. Overwhelming. He stepped closer until there was barely any space between them, until Ezra could feel the heat radiating off his body. Then maybe the answer, Caspian said, voice dropping lower, is that I don't want to find out what happens if you leave. Ezra's heart stuttered. His own pheromones responded instinctively, not in submission, but in resonance. Matching. Aligning. That's dangerous, Ezra said quietly. I know. For both of us. I know. Caspian's other hand came up, cupping the other side of Ezra's face. His thumbs pressed lightly against his jaw, tilting his head up slightly. My beast has been calm for 3 weeks, Caspian said. Do you understand how long it's been since that happened? Since I felt calm, Ezra didn't answer. It's never happened, Caspian continued. Not once. Not until you sat down in that cage and let something that should have killed you rest its head in your lap. His thumbs moved again, soft, almost reverent. You didn't tame it, Omega. You understood it. And in doing that, his voice cracked slightly. You understood me. Ezra's hands came up slowly, deliberately, and rested against Caspian's chest, not pushing him away, not pulling him closer, just there. You're not as broken as you think, Ezra said softly. Caspian let out a breath, something between a laugh and a shudder. Aren't I? No, Ezra said. You're just separated. And separation isn't the same as brokenness. Caspian's forehead dropped forward, pressing against Ezra's. Their breath mingled. Their pheromones wove together, alpha and omega, dominant and resonant, no longer pushing or resisting, just existing in the same space. I don't know how to undo it, Caspian admitted. The separation. I don't know how to be whole again. Yes, you do, Ezra said. You've been learning for 3 weeks. Caspian pulled back just enough to look at him. His eyes were darker than usual, dilated, intense. His control was slipping. He could feel it. The part of him he had locked away, the part that wanted, needed, was pressing against the walls he had built. And for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to keep it contained. Ezra, he said, his name rough on Caspian's tongue, like he was tasting it for the first time. If I lose control, you won't. You don't know that. Ezra's hands slid up Caspian's chest to his shoulders. Steadying. Grounding. I've spent 6 years working with creatures that everyone else had given up on, Ezra said. And do you know what I've learned? Caspian shook his head slightly. Nothing wants to be out of control, Ezra said. Not really. Aggression is just fear. Violence is just pain. And instability. He paused, his thumbs pressing lightly against Caspian's collarbones. Instability is just deprivation dressed up in armor. Caspian's breath shuddered out of him. You're not a monster, Caspian. You're just a man who's been fighting himself for so long that he forgot what it felt like to stop. Something broke behind Caspian's eyes. Not his control. His walls. His hands slid from Ezra's face, down his neck, his shoulders, his arms, until they gripped his wrists. Not hard. Not restraining. Just holding. Like Ezra was the only thing keeping him standing. I don't know how to do this, Caspian admitted. I don't know how to let someone in. Ezra smiled, small, soft, real. Then don't let me in, he said. Just don't push me away. Caspian stared at him for a long moment. Then he pulled Ezra forward, not into a kiss, not yet, just into his chest. His arms wrapped around him, tight and desperate, like he was afraid Ezra would disappear if he let go. And Ezra let him. He let the Alpha King, the most dangerous alpha in the territory, hold him like he was something precious. something worth holding on to. The wolf stirred beside them, lifted its head, watched them with amber eyes that reflected something ancient and knowing. Then it laid its head back down and wagged its tail once, slow, confident, because for the first time in years, its pack was together. The next morning, everything shifted. Not dramatically, not with declarations or grand gestures, but in the small things. The way Caspian started waiting for Ezra at the entrance to the lower levels instead of avoiding him. The way Ezra's hand would brush against Caspian's arm as they walked, casual, natural, like it had always belonged there. The way they started touching without thinking about it. A hand on a lower back, fingers interlaced during debriefs, shoulders pressed together in hallways that were wide enough to accommodate distance they no longer wanted. Graham noticed. Of course he did. But he said nothing, just watched with narrowed eyes and kept his hand off the emergency trigger. The sessions in the enclosure continued. But they were different now, because Caspian started coming down with Ezra. Not inside the cage, not at first, just into the observation room. Watching, feeling, learning to be present instead of separate. The wolf noticed immediately. The first time Caspian stood behind a glass while Ezra worked with it, the beast kept looking up. Not aggressively, not warily, just looking, like it was checking that he was still there. Ezra noticed. It knows you're here, he said quietly during that first session. It can feel you. Caspian's hands pressed against the glass, his jaw tight. Can you feel it? Ezra asked. Caspian nodded once, swallowed. Yes. The breakthrough came on a night when neither of them was expecting it. Ezra had stayed late in the enclosure. The wolf was calm, more than calm, peaceful, curled around him like it had been doing more and more often. He was reading from a tablet, one hand absently stroking the beast's fur, when he heard the inner gate open. He looked up. Caspian stood in the doorway. Alone. No Graham. No security. Just him. His eyes were fixed on the wolf. On them. Come in, Ezra said quietly. Caspian hesitated. His hands were shaking. Ezra could see it from across the room. His pheromones were turbulent, rolling off him in waves of uncertainty and want and fear all tangled together. I don't, Caspian started. Stopped. Swallowed. I don't know if I can. Ezra didn't move. Didn't push. Yes, you do. Caspian's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. And then he stepped forward. One step. Then another. Slow. Careful. Like he was approaching something that might devour him. The wolf lifted its head, watched him approach. But it didn't growl. Didn't tense. It just watched. When Caspian was close enough to touch, close enough to feel the heat radiating off the beast's body, he stopped. His breathing was uneven. His pheromones were wild. I can feel it, he said, voice rough. Everything. All of it. The connection, the want. It's not just the beast anymore. It's me. Ezra stood slowly, not fast enough to startle. Just us. And then he reached out. His hand found Caspian's. Interlocked their fingers. I know, Ezra said. Caspian's eyes squeezed shut. His grip on Ezra's hand tightened. I've spent 15 years trying to cut out the part of me that felt like this, Caspian said. The part that wanted. That needed. I told myself it was weakness. That it was dangerous. That if I let it out, I'd hurt someone. His voice cracked. But it's not dangerous, is it? Not with you. Ezra squeezed his hand back. No, he said softly. Not with me. Caspian opened his eyes. Looked down at the wolf, still watching, still calm, still present. Can I? He stopped. Started again. Can I touch it? Ezra studied his face for a long moment. Saw the fear there. The hope. The desperate, aching need to finally be whole. Ask it, Ezra said. Not me. Caspian's breath caught. He turned to face the wolf fully. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to his knees, not in submission, but in offering, in vulnerability. And he held out his hand, palm open, low, just like Ezra had done on that first day. The wolf watched him for a long, suspended moment. Then it rose. Caspian didn't move, didn't breathe. The beast stepped closer. One step, two. Its massive head lowered, nostrils flaring as it inhaled Caspian's scent. And then slowly, almost hesitantly, it pressed its head into Caspian's open palm. The contact was electric. Caspian gasped. His whole body shuddered. His pheromones, which had been turbulent, unstable, suddenly surged. Not in dominance, in recognition. Because for the first time in 15 years, he was touching the part himself he had cut away. And it didn't hurt him. It welcomed him. The wolf let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, not a whine. Something deeper. Something that vibrated through the floor, through the walls, through Caspian's very bones. A sound of coming home. Caspian's other hand came up, both hands now cradling the wolf's massive head. His forehead dropped forward until it pressed against the beast's fur. And he wept. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just tears sliding down his cheeks, silent and steady, as 15 years of isolation finally cracked open. Ezra didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, one hand still resting on the wolf's back, the other now gentle on Caspian's shoulder. Grounded, present, together. They stayed like that for a long time. Caspian didn't pull away. Neither did the wolf. Eventually, Caspian's knees gave out, not from weakness, from release, and he sank fully to the ground. The wolf followed him down, massive body shifting until it was curled around him the same way it curled around Ezra. And Caspian felt it. For the first time, he felt the connection not as something separate, not as a beast he had to control, not as a part of himself he had to suppress, but as something integral. Something that had always been a part of him, waiting to be acknowledged. "I'm sorry," he whispered into the wolf's fur. "I'm so sorry I left you alone." The wolf's tail moved. Slow, steady. Forgiveness. Ezra sat down beside them, close enough to touch, close enough to be part of the circle. "The bond isn't something you need to fear," he said quietly. "It's not a weakness. It's not a weapon. It's just connection. And connection doesn't have to be controlling. It can just be." Caspian turned his head. His eyes were red-rimmed. 但他的眼神变了。不再封闭，不再防御。Open. "How do you know that?" he asked. Ezra smiled. Soft, set, real. "Because I've spent 6 years learning it from creatures that everyone else gave up on," he said. "And because," he paused, "because I can feel it too. When I'm with you, when the wolf is calm, when we're all here together." He reached out, brushed a tear from Caspian's cheek with his thumb. "There's nothing wrong with needing someone, Caspian." Caspian's hand came up, caught Ezra's, held it against his chest. "And what if that someone is you?" he asked, voice rough, raw, real. Ezra's heart stuttered. His pheromones shifted, not intentionally, not strategically, just reacting, reaching toward Caspian the way they had been reaching for weeks. "Then I'd say," Ezra said slowly, "that you're not the only one." Caspian's eyes widened slightly, and then slowly, carefully, like he was asking permission with every inch, he leaned forward. Close, closer, until their foreheads were touching, until their breath was shared, until the space between them was filled with nothing but warmth and pheromones, and the quiet hum of something that had been building since the moment Ezra first sat down in that cage. "Can I kiss you?" Caspian asked. Ezra's breath caught. Not because he was afraid, not because he was unsure, but because no one had ever asked him that before. Not like this, not with this much care. "Yes," he whispered. Caspian closed the distance. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like they were both testing boundaries that had never been tested before. Caspian's lips were warm, slightly chapped, moving against Ezra's with a gentleness that contradicted everything the world believed about Alpha Kings. Then Ezra's hand slid into Caspian's hair, and something surged. The kiss deepened. Caspian made a sound, low, rough, almost pained, and his arms wrapped around Ezra, pulling him closer, pulling him in. His pheromones flooded the space, no longer restrained, no longer controlled, just felt. And Ezra's met them, not in submission, not in resistance, in resonance. The wolf stirred between them, not waking, not interrupting, just adjusting, shifting its massive body so they could both lean against it, so they could both be held. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caspian's forehead rested against Ezra's. "I don't want to go back to how it was before," Caspian said. "Then don't," Ezra said simply. Caspian's eyes opened. Met Eshrash, and the bond, the beast. "It's not a beast anymore," Ezra said. "Not really. It's just the part of you that you were too afraid to love." Caspian's breath shuddered out of him. "Love," he repeated, like the word was foreign, like he was tasting it for the first time. Ezra smiled. "Yeah," he said. "Love." The next few days were a blur of small changes that added up to something enormous. Caspian stopped avoiding the lower levels. He started spending time in the enclosure, not just watching through the glass, but being there, sitting on the floor with Ezra, letting the wolf lean against him, learning to exist in the same space as the part himself he had rejected for so long. The wolf responded immediately. It became calmer, more grounded, less needy because it wasn't starved anymore. It had contact. It had connection. It had pack. And Caspian changed too. His pheromones, once so controlled they felt artificial, started to breathe. They fluctuated naturally, dominant one moment, uncertain the next, warm and present in between. He smiled more, laughed once when the wolf brought him a rock and dropped it in his lap with an expectant look. Graham watched it all with an expression that slowly shifted from suspicion to something like relief. "They're good for each other," he said to one of his security team members. Quiet, unwilling to be overheard. The Omega in him. I didn't think anyone could reach him. The other Alpha just nodded. No one disagreed. It was on the 5th night after Caspian first touched the wolf that everything broke open. Ezra was in the enclosure as usual. The wolf was asleep, really asleep, not just resting, but deep. Its breathing was slow and even, its body loose and relaxed in a way it had never been before. Caspian was there too, sitting against the wall, close enough that his shoulder brushed Ezra's. His hand rested on the wolf's side, feeling the slow rise and fall of its breath. Neither of them was talking. Neither of them needed to. Then Ezra's scent shifted. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. Just a slight change in the pheromones he was putting out, a warmth, a sweetness that hadn't been there before. Caspian noticed immediately. His head turned. His eyes found Ezra's face. "Ezra," he said slowly, "your sin." "I know," Ezra said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that sounded like effort. Caspian's heart rate spiked. His own pheromones responded instinctively, not in dominance, but in awareness, because he knew that scent. Every Alpha did. It was preheat. "When?" Caspian asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Ezra exhaled slowly. "Soon. A day, maybe two. My cycles have always been irregular, but—" He paused. "The bond. The resonance. I think it triggered something." Caspian's hand tightened on the wolf's fur. "You should leave," he said. Not because he wanted to, because he was trying to be safe. Ezra didn't move. "No." Caspian's jaw tightened. "Ezra." I said no. Ezra turned to face him fully. His eyes were calm, certain. "I'm not leaving." Caspian's control, already fragile after weeks of connection, already cracked after the kiss, started to splinter. You don't understand, he said. If you go into heat here, if I'm anywhere near you when it happens, I won't be able to. To what? Ezra asked. Not challenging. Just asking. Caspian's breath came faster. His pheromones spiked, sharp, alpha, hungry. To stop myself, he admitted. Ezra was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out, took Caspian's hand, pressed it flat against his own chest, over his heart. Who said I wanted you to stop? Caspian froze. His eyes widened. His pupils dilated. His whole body went rigid, not with tension, with want. Ezra, I'm not asking you to bond with me, Ezra said, voice still steady, still calm, still him. Not yet. Not unless you want it. But I'm not going to hide from you. And I'm not going to let you hide from me. Caspian's hand trembled against Ezra's chest. You don't know what you're asking. Yes, I do, Ezra said. I've spent 6 years working with unstable alphas. I've been through heats alone, in controlled environments, with suppressants, with every safety measure in place. I know what I'm risking. He squeezed Caspian's hand. But I've never, he paused, swallowed. For the first time, his voice cracked. I've never had someone I wanted to be with during it. Caspian made a sound, low, pained, desperate. His forehead dropped forward against Ezra's shoulder. If I mark you, he said, voice muffled, I won't be able to take it back. If I bond with you, if I claim you, it's permanent. I know. 15 years, Caspian said. 15 years I've kept myself locked away because I was afraid of what would happen if I let go. And now he pulled back, looked at Ezra with eyes that were wild and raw and terrified. Now you're telling me to let go anyway. Ezra cupped his face in both hands, held him steady. I'm telling you that you don't have to be afraid anymore, he said. Not of yourself. Not of me. Caspian's eyes searched his. You really trust me that much? Ezra smiled. You really have to ask. The heat hit 24 hours later. Ezra woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, pheromones flooding the room, every nerve in his body firing at once. His skin was too hot. His thoughts were too scattered. And he could smell Caspian. Not in the room. Not close. Just present. Everywhere. On the blankets Graham had brought from the upper levels. On the shirt Ezra was wearing, the one he had borrowed from Caspian without asking. His Omega instincts surged, overwhelming, desperate. Alpha. Want. Need. He tried to breathe through it. Tried to center himself. But the heat was stronger than it had ever been, amplified by the bond, by the connection, by weeks of proximity to an alpha whose pheromones match his own in ways he had never experienced before. He didn't hear the door open, but he felt it. The shift in air. The weight of a presence that made his Omega instincts sing. Caspian stood in the doorway. His eyes were dark, dilated, burning. His pheromones were flooding the room, thick and heavy and answering. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. I could smell you from upstairs, he said. His voice was rough, unsteady, from 3 levels away. Ezra's breath came in short, sharp gasps. Caspian. I tried to stay away. Caspian stepped forward. 1 step. 2. I try to give you space. To let you handle it alone like you said you always had. He stopped at the edge of the bed. But I can't. Ezra reached for him. Caspian caught his hand, not gently, not carefully, but firmly, desperately. He pulled Ezra up, pulled him close, pulled him against his chest. And then he buried his face in Ezra's neck. The scent there, heat-sweet Omegas, made him groan, made his control shatter. Tell me to stop, he said against Ezra's skin. Tell me to leave, and I will. I'll lock myself in the upper levels until it's over. Oh, Caspian. Ezra's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through everything. Don't. Caspian's grip tightened. Don't what? Don't leave. Caspian pulled back just enough to look at him. His eyes were burning, gold bleeding into the edges of his irises. His beast was close to the surface, closer than it had been in years. If I stay, he said, I won't be able to control myself. Not fully. I'll want to mark you, claim you, bond with you. Ezra's hand slid up Caspian's chest, curled around the back of his neck. Then do it. Caspian's breath stopped. Ezra, I'm not asking you to be gentle, Ezra said. I'm not asking you to hold back. I'm asking you to trust me, the same way I trust you. Caspian stared at him for a long, suspended moment. Then something behind his eyes broke. He kissed Ezra like a starving man, like he had been waiting for permission for 15 years and had finally been given it. His hands were everywhere, in Ezra's hair, on his hips, gripping his thighs, pulling him closer, pulling him under. Ezra met him with equal intensity. His heat made everything sharper. Every touch, every kiss, every brush of Caspian's pheromones against his own. His omega instinct screamed, yes, yes, this him, alpha of mine. And Caspian's beast answered, not as something separate, not as something contained, but as something whole. Because when Caspian finally sank into him, when their bodies joined and their scents merged and their hearts beat against each other like they had been designed to fit, the wolf inside him didn't fight. It rejoiced. The mark came later. Not during the first wave. Caspian had enough control left for that, barely. He had held himself back, focused on Ezra's pleasure, on the heat, on the overwhelming rightness of being connected like this. But during the second wave, hours later, when Ezra was trembling and oversensitive and still needing, Caspian's control finally snapped. His teeth found the junction of Ezra's neck and shoulder, and he bit down. Ezra cried out, not in pain and release. His whole body arched, his pheromones surging, his omega instinct singing as Caspian's alpha claimed him. Not as property, not as possession, as mate. The bond snapped into place between them, not the faint, filtered connection they had felt through the wolf, but something direct, something permanent. Ezra felt everything Caspian felt. The years of loneliness, the fear of his own nature, the desperate, aching need to be seen. And Caspian felt everything Ezra felt. The determination, the compassion, the quiet, steady strength of someone who had spent years caring for creatures that everyone else had given up on. When Caspian finally pulled back, licking the wound clean, his eyes were wet. I'm sorry, he said. I should have asked. I should have. Ezra's hand came up, covered his mouth. I told you to stop asking, Ezra said. His voice was hoarse, exhausted, but happy. I told you I trusted you. Caspian's shoulders shook. I've never, he stopped, swallowed. I've never had someone trust me like that. Ezra pulled him down, wrapped around him like the wolf had wrapped around them both. Then get used to it, he said, because I'm not going anywhere. The wolf, stirring from its spot at the foot of the bed, lifted its head, watched them for a long moment. Then it wagged its tail. Slow. Continent. Home. Epilogue. 1 month later. The sanctuary was saved. Caspian had made sure of it, not just with funding, but with resources. Land. Security. A team of veterinarians and handlers that Ezra had personally approved. The animals that had been at risk of euthanasia now had a future. But more importantly, the wolf was gone. Not dead. Not disappeared. Integrated. The enclosure stood empty now, cleaned out, decommissioned, a monument to something that no longer needed to be contained. Because the beast that had lived there was no longer separate. It was part of Caspian. Part of them. Ezra stood at the window of Caspian's study, their study now, though neither of them had said it out loud, looking out over the mountains. The morning light was gold and soft, painting everything in warmth. Arms wrapped around him from behind. Caspian's chin rested on his shoulder. His pheromones, still dominant, still alpha, but softer now, warmer, wrapped around Ezra like a second skin. You're thinking too loud, Caspian murmured. Ezra leaned back into him. I'm thinking about the wolf. Caspian was quiet for a moment. Then, it's not gone, you know. I can still feel it. Feel him. He's just not separate anymore. I know, Ezra said. That's what I was thinking about. Caspian pressed a kiss to the mark on Ezra's neck, now healed, now permanent, now a part of him in ways that went beyond skin. You changed everything, Caspian said quietly. You walked into a cage with something that should have killed you. And instead of running, you sat down. You stayed. Ezra turned in his arms, faced him. I told you, he said. I don't tame things. I understand them. Caspian's hand came up, cupped his face, thumb brushing over Ezra's cheekbone. And what do you understand about me? Ezra smiled. That you're not a monster, he said. You never were. You were just waiting for someone to remind you of who you really are. Caspian's eyes glistened. And who is that? Ezra rose onto his toes, pressed a soft kiss to Caspian's lips. Mine, he whispered. And I'm yours. Caspian kissed him back, deep, slow, forever. And somewhere deep inside him, in a place where the beast had lived, in a place where connection lived, in a place where love lived, the wolf wagged its tail. Then